It's my pleasure to introduce Sharon Ryan, and Kaitlin Northey. Sharon is Professor of Early Childhood and Elementary Education here at the GSC and Chair of the Department of Learning and Teaching. She is also a Research Fellow at the National Institute of Early Education Research, where she is working on a recent $500,000 grant from the New Jersey Department of Education to write and develop professional development for grades 1 to 3 early learning guidelines. She has a background as a preschool teacher, curriculum advisor, special educator, and her most recent work has focused on the implementation of publicly funded preschool in the state of New Jersey. Kaitlin Northey is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Learning and Teaching. She focuses on how early education policies are experienced by stakeholders, including children, families, teachers, and administrators, and how these policies work to shape the early education workforce. Welcome.
Hi. All right, so we're going to start by talking about why is pre-K important. A lot of people think, well, that doesn't matter, it's just little kids, what the hell? Well, in case you haven't noticed, NEAR continues to grow and makes millions of dollars and helps generate income for the GSE, because pre-K is now seen as one of the biggest policy levers in this country to ameliorate the effects of poverty and ensure that kids enter not only school ready to learn, but to continue to learn as they move through the grades. And President Obama said in his State of the Union address of 2013, and this is drawing on the longitudinal research that's been done on pre-K programs in this country, every dollar we invest in high quality early childhood education can save more than $7 later on. You can see how the economists are in there. By boosting graduation rates, reducing teen pregnancy, even reducing violent crime. In states that make it a priority to educate our youngest children, like Georgia or Oklahoma or New Jersey, I would add, studies show students grow up more likely to read and do math at grade level, graduate high school, hold a job, form more stable families of their own. We know this works, so let's do what works and make sure none of our children start the race of life already behind. That makes pre-K sound like the wonderful saviour and we can solve all problems, but to make that work is quite a serious undertaking. Currently in the United States, or in 2013, there are over 1.3 million being served by 53 different pre-K programs across 40 states in the District of Columbia. So you can see there's already a problem. We have 50 states, but 53 pre-K programs. So that's because some states have more than one kind of program depending on the children they're targeting. And part of the other issue is that nothing's easy in early childhood. Early childhood has been delivered through a range of different programs, each sort of with a different institutional history. When women were asked to go to work and support several of the wars, we had childcare, then it went away. Head Start was created as a particular program to target disadvantaged children in the 1960s and has stayed, but has different kinds of values that support that program than, say, public school programs, which for the most part until the last 10 or so years, focus public pre-K on kids with special needs primarily, right? So each has different funding streams, each has different values driving what is the program supposed to look like, and each has a different sort of history which shapes what they look like in practice. But the problem is, if you're going to be a state that's going to offer pre-K, you can either build on those programs that you already have, or you can say, what the hell, we'll just find 4,000 classrooms in a city and we'll make pre-K happen. Well, most school districts can't do that. And whilst public pre-K is being administered through public school institutional institutions, it is actually being delivered through mixed delivery service models, whereby public schools are partnering with Head Start agencies and with childcare programs. Some of them, some are private, some are public, some are non-profit, some are for-profit, some have been parent cooperatives that have become now public pre-K. They're now offering public pre-K in these mixed service delivery systems, which makes total sense economically. But the dilemma is, if you want to reap the benefits of high quality public pre-K education, then you have to ensure you've got quality. And one of the problems is that we know from much of the research, particularly on childcare and Head Start, is that the quality of these programs is extremely variable. And many kids may be in public pre-K programs that don't have the quality necessary to produce the results we know can happen with high quality programs. So what does high quality mean? Well, basically it's a combination of structural and process variables. Structure is a sort of like the policy levers we have, like class size, staff to student ratio, teacher qualifications. So in the case of high quality, we know those structural variables are small student, lots of teachers to small numbers of kids. We know it's a small class size of between 15 and 20, not the 30 kids that you see in your high school classrooms. We know that it's got a curriculum that's been found to be research proven. We know it requires teachers with bachelor's degrees, but also teachers with specific expertise and qualifications in teaching in the early years, among many other things. Now, process indicators are typically the life in early childhood settings. What is it that goes on between teachers and children in the everyday, and the same with the organisational culture of the school. And not as much research has been done on process factors, and the idea being that good quality teaching in early childhood is what we call developmentally appropriate. We don't start beginning with subject matter, we start from the child first, how they learn, how they develop. Then we bring subject matter. So we combine these sort of two strands of thought. So every teacher who works well with young children is both culturally relevant, understands where they what the typical trajectories of development are or the progressions are, and also has a real understanding of those particular individual children in his or her classroom. The trouble is, because you bung Head Start with childcare, with public schools, each with different values, because if you've done, if you've gone into schools, they have a very different feeling than when you go into a local childcare centre or a local Head Start program, a very different feeling, then it's going to be pretty hard to bring them together to create something that's consistent in terms of quality. So what does a policymaker do? They go, I got a solution for this. We'll just throw in some standards. In fact, we'll throw in lots of standards. And so basically standards in early childhood really weren't there except in terms of how you have to meet particular funding requirements, right? Now they're much more different than that. They define what kids should be able to know and do at 3, at 4. We even had infant and toddler standards around this country now. And we just instituted some in New Jersey a few years ago. They also provide evidence of quality. They're a way to ensure program improvement over time. If you're not reaching the standard, how do we get you to this standard? And most importantly, they ensure alignment across programs, so horizontal alignment across Head Start, childcare, and public school programs. So in early childhood, or the ones before you enter school, they tend to be focused on particular domains of development as well as subject matter knowledge. They're also organised often by ages, so you'll see birth to 2, 3 to 5, or 4-year-olds, and then you'll see kindergarten, and then what I'm currently working on for the state is 1st through 3rd grade guidelines. God help me.
So while systematizing is a good idea, it's not going to help if nobody is using it. So one of the things that the Obama administration did when they did the Race to the Top Early Learning Challenge grant is they required that states start to use early learning standards. So here you can see the different years and the percentage of programs that adopted them. By 2013, 100% of the 53 public pre-K programs are driven by early learning standards. That's what the policymakers think. So one of the things when you look at early education research is the majority of the studies are all state evaluations or evaluations of those different public pre-K programs. So what we did in our study that we're presenting to you today is that we actually looked at how policy is experienced from the level of the child out and up through policymakers. So our mission was really to explore what guided everyday implementation of pre-K programs, because policymakers will say, oh, it's standard, it's guidelines, it's all of these things that we have put on the books to guide programs, but teachers and leaders from the districts tell a different story. So our research questions for this study are, broadly, what guides a program? And how have pre-K programs in 2 states responded to early learning standards? And how are standards present in teachers or leaders' practices?
Okay, so when you do this kind of study, you've got to have some kind of theory, right? Well, the theories of policy implementation, g'day Amy, have for the most part been sort of like directional studies. There's either some of the earliest work focused on fidelity of implementation, and this is what administrators often do, God help them, they have to, but are you meeting the standards we've set out for you? Are they being implemented as intended? Then there's research and theory that tend to think of policy as more of a mutually adaptive process, right? It's shaped by local actors and who they are and how they negotiate. And often they may resist it or they may just tweak a little bit, which is why we've had, I think, for example, in professional development research, nowhere has more money been spent, Michael Fullerman said, and had little effort, a little impact for the dollars spent. But we're actually taking the work of Stephen J. Ball, and we've only just started using his work around this notion of policy enactments, which doesn't assume a top-down or a bottom-up shaping process or a mutually adaptive process, but rather something that's very multidimensional. Teachers are policy actors, not simply policy subjects, and how they implement policy is really shaped by not only their own views and values and beliefs about what constitutes good practice, but also by the affordances within the context in which they work and the constraints within those contexts, as well as the organisational ethos or culture. And so the other thing that enactment research really starts to question is, who's benefiting from these kinds of policy enactments? So the notion is it's not just an enactment of policy, but policy enactments over time. And different policy pieces take place at different points, even within the day. So we've noticed how key structural policies in another paper are actually not implemented at all, even though it's detrimental to kids. So what we've been trying to focus on is the interactions between all the different policy actors. So to do that, we created a case study that sort of compared two states. So this is funded by the Spencer Foundation, who funded my colleague Beth Grau and I to conduct this study looking at two mature programs, but two very different pre-K programs. Wisconsin is all local control, has a huge history of local control. So they basically have very different quality indicators than us. They have qualified teachers, but if the teacher is working in, say, a childcare context, the district doesn't have to pay them the same rate as you would in a public school. They can make that program into whatever they like. They have learning standards, but they don't have to necessarily, they shape what the program looks like, how it's enacted. It's half day, but it's for every kid. So if you have a 4-year-old living in this district, that child is eligible to go to pre-K. New Jersey, on the other hand, really came about because of the Abbott versus Supreme Court decisions in 1998, which said that a fair and equal education was not being provided to children in the lowest income districts. And so one of the ways to ameliorate that disadvantage was to not only require whole school reform, but also the implementation of high quality pre-K programs for 3- and 4-year-old children in every one of those districts. There's now 35 districts that receive public pre-K funding, but there's also an extra 100 or so that get what's called ELI funding, which is this sort of like pre-K expansion projects. They don't have as many requirements, but they still are offering public pre-K. The Abbott programs, or the former Abbott programs, are quite different. They are a 6-day program with very specified expectations. You must use a research-proven curriculum model, and there's only 5 you can choose from by the state. You must have a qualified teacher with a bachelor's degree in P3 in every classroom, with a teaching assistant to every 15 children. They provide early intervention services for children, including special needs services, English language support services, and they've also created a whole kind of infrastructure within school districts so that now most school districts have an administration layer devoted to early education with early childhood supervisors, master teachers who are like curriculum coaches and others. So if you look at the benchmarks, so NEAR has created benchmarks of quality, and that's what Steve's super busy on at the moment because the yearbook's about to come out, that compare what different states do. And you can see in many ways New Jersey and Wisconsin are very similar. They require high school diplomas and things. But you'll notice here, this is where these are our benchmarks. You've got to have 15 kids. You have to have a ratio of 2 to 15, whereas all of these things in Wisconsin can be determined locally. All right, so how do we look at life in early childhood settings? Well, we picked 3 sites: a childcare site, a Head Start site, and a public school site, all of them working in very different kinds of districts because as a qualitative research, it's primarily a qualitative study, we want to ensure maximum variations to try and get a range of the experience of policy implementation. So Vale Park is a very rural, I went there for every week for like 2 years, it looks like. It's way down south. It feels like a rural district. It's still got 45-degree angle parking in the main street, yet it's got 61,000 people. It's got some of the very diverse, an increasingly large Russian population and Hispanic population. Most of they had 40 classrooms in public schools. They'd actually created an early childhood centre with like 30 classrooms, as well as 62 classrooms in private childcare. We were in a private childcare site that was surrounded by woods and deer, and you go down the road, there's the market gardens. Rome, on the other hand, is a very small town located near the sea. It's in a public school, 4 classrooms in a primary school site, which we didn't visit. We actually visited one of the 7 off-site classrooms. And Nord, which is like gigantor city with incredible diversity, serving 36 public school had public pre-K, 77 private pre-K providers, and 41 Head Start sites. In Norwood, we were in one of the Head Start sites. Wisconsin also did, but they didn't have like gigantor. They weren't going to go to Milwaukee, so they went to a rural town, to a small urban and another small town. And they looked again, they had a lot of trouble. Getting into Head Start sites is very hard to do, so they ended up doing 2 childcare sites, which was in one in Belford, one in Dixon, and then they went to a public school site in Pickering. So how do we collect lots of so much rich data on our policy implementation in these sites? Well, we wanted to focus from the child out. So we should probably go back to the next one. To the next one. Yeah. So to get our kids' experiences, we followed 2 focal children in each of those sites. That's 6 kids, 6 focal kids. And to get their experiences of life in early childhood, we actually got them to take photographs of the everyday, made books out of them, and we interviewed them about what they said. So for them, things that were important were like the cubbies, because it's your own space. You know, we're looking at the curriculum and what do you learn, and they don't want to tell us anything about that. We also talked to families. We did home visits for families for 3 times over the year, and then when the children went to the kindergarten year. And we did weekly observations, really focusing on one child at a time, and teacher interviews and time diaries, which, if you don't know, is a method where you actually get teachers to document their time on a particular day, how they spend their time in a 24-hour period, to look at trends in time. We did that over 3 different parts of the school year. Then to get to the next level, the administration, we interviewed whatever administration structure they had. So at the program level, that might be a principal, it might be a director of the site, it might be, in the case of Head Start, the executive director of the pre-K program and the director of the site. It also could be an early childhood supervisor. It might also be a master teacher. It just depended on the site. And then at the policy level, we talked to state legislators, state administrators, and we read a ton of policy documents. And we also collected tons of artifacts of what kids were doing in classrooms, what teachers were doing, collected lesson plans. We collected lots of stuff. And it was the highlight of my year being in these classrooms. It was just so cool. So data analysis. Well, what we're going to do today, we're not going to focus on children's experiences, but to focus more on the teachers and the leaders. We can't wait to dig down into the kids' experiences. What we did was we first of all took the state level data, which was interviews with key administrators and policy documents to give us a sense of the policy context. What's the history of New Jersey's pre-K program? How do policymakers talk about the program, how it came into being and how it's changed over time? We then went through our data set, uploading everything into Deduce, and looked at all the administrator and teacher interviews and observational data, coding specifically with the term standards and policy. We did that in relationship to our colleagues in Wisconsin, so we were doing some member checking or sort of like peer review between each other about what we thought counted as policy, what we thought counted as standards. Once we'd identified those excerpts in the data set, we then went about coding using both this notion of fidelity and mutual adaptation and enactment stuff, as well as to really think about what aspects of the standards are they implementing. Are they implementing standards? What does it look like? We then sort of brought that together to try and create these mini case studies, which I would call mini portraits for today, because they're just the start of something. Okay, so as I said, New Jersey has 2 sets of standards, and we're going to be presenting on New Jersey today. It has these beautiful preschool program implementation guidelines, which every district must follow. It's like it's a big report, and they have to show each year that they've met those guidelines. It includes, in fact, people like Steve and I helped write them 12 years ago or so, 13 years ago, whenever I started at this wonderful institution. But they really guide decision making. You have to meet these guidelines to be able to get your funding. So you have to show they have criteria for how many master teachers or curriculum coaches you should have by numbers of kids, how many ELL teachers for early education you should have by numbers of kids. They dictate qualifications, professional development plans for teachers, assessment plans. They're supposed to have a transition plan for kids moving from pre-K to kindergarten, which is a big deal. Once you go through that, those of you who are about to become parents or have parents of young kids, you'll know why it's a big deal. And then the thing that we're focusing on also is these things called preschool learning and teaching expectations. These are actually the learning that look like this. This is in science. You'll see there's a beautiful number which connects to the P to 12 database on the New Jersey Department of Education website. It says things like, children will explore and describe characteristics of soil, rocks, water, and air, right? And then when you click a little bit more, you'll see it also has teaching practices linked specifically to those standards. So the teachers have very explicit guidance about what they are supposed to do, like use classroom experiences to assist children in developing an awareness of conservation and respect for the natural environment in everyday context. So we were trying to see teachers even use these. Did administrators talk about them? Because they sure took a lot of work to write. And are they even using them in their everyday practice? So I'm going to talk about Vale Park, which is this is my focal child. I just had a great blast with her until I was in kindergarten and she was bored out of her brain. As I said, large town and semi-rural area with 1,450 children served across a number of sites. This town was really interesting. They really got this notion of developmentally appropriate practice. They really adhered to the preschool program implementation guidelines. Everything was structured to be sort of like very consistent with what the state was requiring. And they really got the fact that it was important that they were preparing kids ready for school, to be ready for school, but in a way that really understood how young children learned and developed. So this is what the leader's interpretation. So they had a principal, not an early childhood supervisor, because that was her job really. And then they also had an early childhood curriculum director in this site. And she said, the policy is a child 3 or 4 on or before October 1st who has residency in Vale Park has a wonderful opportunity to attend a 6-hour preschool program that offers high-quality, developmentally appropriate learning activities, breakfast, lunch, and nap time. These are all in the state policy, including what lunch should look like. Lots of language going on throughout the day, teachers and assistants, and lots of problem solving. We're really teaching children how to think early on, right? And if you look at what was going on, this emphasis on developmentally appropriate practice was really important to them. But there were other policy actors in this community shaping or trying to shape what they were doing. So one of the things that was going on was that the kindergarten teachers were saying, these pre-K kids, they know nothing. They can't sit still, they can't listen, they can't write, they can't read, they don't know 300 numbers to spout off. So you know what? We're going to get them better, so we want you to implement this new literacy curriculum. And the early childhood supervisor was very strong about fighting back and really keeping to this notion of developmentally appropriate practice. She said there's a big push for children's literacy initiative in kindergarten, and they're using that in kindergarten. They wanted us to implement it, so we didn't implement it. But the principal and I did go with the superintendent to Philadelphia schools and observe it, and then looked at where we could put in similarities so that it would still be true to our curriculum, which in this case is a high scope curriculum. But try to make it so there will be a better transition between pre-K and kindergarten. So they did sort of like a little bit of mutual adaptation. They shaped it a little bit. They said, no, we're going to resist this push down from the kindergarten teachers and principals that are telling us we must adhere to this much more scope and sequence kind of literacy curriculum. And they really did believe in these standards. This is hard to see, but you'll notice all the red are actually very specific, identified. She has numbers. So Suzanne, the teacher, had numbers for every single standard she was using on every lesson plan for every day for every week. And she really wrote like the standards. And she was very committed to them. She didn't see them as being horrible. She saw them as a really good guideline to what she was doing. So for example, when you went to a classroom, you would see her taking, identifying kids who, she would learn the words to speak in both Russian and Hispanic to her kids who were English language learners. She would spend a lot of time, everything was scripted to the time of the schedule of the curriculum, but she really did a lot of this picking up on where kids were. So for example, one of these children really got into Bigfoot. Now, some teachers be like, I'm not doing Bigfoot in my classroom, that's going to create chaos. She instead got them creating backpacks, binoculars, going off to explore what might be a Bigfoot, reading books about potential, what looks like a Bigfoot, doing searches, creating little manuals, writing, so building on their literacy skills, writing down what they investigated about Bigfoot. She really sort of brought to light this notion of picking up on who kids are and bringing content to them, not the other way around. But she felt, just like the principal and the supervisor did in this district, really pushed and being shaped by the values of the kindergarten teachers in particular. And she said, I don't think the kindergarten teachers are developmentally appropriate. If we're sending them to kindergarten, they don't know all their numbers and they don't know all their letters, but they have accomplished other milestones that were typical for them. But the kindergarten teachers don't see that. You know, it's kind of like expecting a kid to act like a robot coming in from pre-K to kindergarten. So whilst we saw a great adherence to the standards that have been prescribed by the state and a commitment to them, the values shaping what guided the program, there was a lot of pushing from the kindergarten teachers, which we're beginning to sort of investigate further.
Sharon, were they using a standardized curriculum?
High scope. They all have to. No choice.
So another district that we were in was Rogue, which used Tools of the Mind. And this district was squeezed between more affluent districts. So where we were was an off-site classroom. So what happened was that the children were actually bused in, where the other children in the district got to walk to the primary school. These children were bused in past humongous houses, lots of small businesses, and they pulled in front of this really big, intimidating high school. They got off their bus. I mean, these children are 4 and 5 years old, and some of them 3. And they walked through this huge, intimidating high school, out the back door, down a set of stairs, up a set of different stairs, into 4 small classrooms. Totally isolated from the rest of the community, really. So what we found in this district was that the leader's vision and commitment to making bilingual children a part of the district led how the teachers taught the children and their commitment to see these children succeed. So one of the people we interviewed was the superintendent. The superintendent is one of only 9 Latino or Latina superintendents in the state of New Jersey at that time. And she said basically that the obligation of supporting a bilingual ESL child is the same as meeting a child with special needs, and that the district needs to be just as committed. So she really saw her identity as a bilingual individual as a strength, that she could go to the Board of Education and communicate the obligation and its responsibility to work with these families as the guidelines dictate they do, but not just to work with them on a surface level, actually try to get them involved. So she said, you know, it's more like we need to look at ourselves as a strength and something that we need to build on. I know we need to help children develop, acquire that second language, English, but at the same time, continue to nurture their development as though they were monolingual. So this commitment to actually treating these children as children and not children that need to learn English was really actually pretty impressive. Furthermore, she said she wanted to shift the thinking in the whole community rather than these children are a problem in our schools to let's maximize the potential of these kids and present them with the best possible learning opportunities. Because these children are not with us just for pre-K. They stay with us throughout the school system, so let's get them prepared to be active members. This goal was communicated and read loud and clear by the teacher. The teacher, when we asked her about the goals of pre-K in her district, said the goal is to have kids by 3rd grade not really needing bilingual education, to filter them into the mainstream, to have them not rely so much on their home language. It's always important to support the home language, but we want them, especially with testing, which is a big milestone in 3rd grade, to be able to succeed in the regular all English setting, to be just as proficient as English as they are in their home language. One of the ways that she did this wasn't through what the superintendent talked about, that commitment to developmentally appropriate practice, that commitment to treating the child as a whole child. She actually pulled down the kindergarten curriculum. So we're not talking about push down, because this district actually had alignment between the pre-K curriculum and the kindergarten curriculum. Tools of the Mind went all the way through. So the district, from on paper, it looks like we're going to prepare these children through this curriculum in a developmentally appropriate way, and then they're going to arrive in kindergarten and they're going to be ready to tackle these things. She said, I'm going to pull down that kindergarten curriculum. So she has friends that are kindergarten teachers and familiar with what they do. So she said, a lot of the stuff I do in the classroom in terms of reading and sight words is based off of what they do in kindergarten. At the end of preschool, they test children's language to see where they are. So throughout the year, I focus on different tactics and content areas that I know are integral to what they're going to be doing. So these children were actually going through the curriculum as they were supposed to. This is a very Tools of the Mind lesson plan that she had to submit. But at the same point, whenever possible, it identifies how English language learners are going to be supported. So this was a clear commitment, and she also would call them up to her desk. She'd ask them things like, okay, I need you to count how many objects I have, how many of these things. all to prep them for those end of the year tests that would then help place them into kindergarten classrooms. So in that district, we really saw that the need for these children to succeed drove the instruction in that pre-K classroom. They wanted these kids to be ready. They wanted them to be English proficient. The teacher that we observed actually was kind of bilingual. She tried, but it was a tension in their district. So in the large urban district, Norwood, we actually see a different set of circumstances where they're not just navigating the program guidelines and standards of New Jersey, but they're also navigating federal Head Start guidelines. So this was the only Head Start site that we were in New Jersey, but the teacher ended up doing double work because her preschool classroom was located in a Head Start site. So the district decided that she should, even though she's not a Head Start teacher, she's paid on a completely different scale, she has a different set of qualifications, she should meet both sets of requirements. Now,
amazing teacher, unbelievable.
She is fantastic. So the leader in this district, to say she's passionate is the understatement of the century. So she is dedicated to these children. She's dedicated to providing caring teachers for all of these children, and she's dedicated to altering the curriculum to make more of a literacy focus. So they use creative curriculum, but she actually supplemented with model writing and a number of practices. So she said, I believe that it's my right to protect children. I've walked into classrooms where I've heard adults who I pay their bills talk to children like they're felons in Northern State Penitentiary. And the kid doesn't bat an eyelash. Why? Because he gets it all the time, you know? So we have to be that change. We are that agent. So she's committed to this change, and she's adopted a number of practices to help supplement the regular curriculum. And her superiors in the district questioned her. They said, you know, here we are. We have these program guidelines. We have these standards that we're trying to meet to keep this developmentally appropriate. And she said, no, we're doing this literacy stuff. She said, if my superintendent finds that my rigorous attempts, my rigorous approaches in literacy are bad, then I don't want this job anymore. I won't do it because I'm right. I'm right. And the state needs to get the hell over it and stop insulting the children of this city, right? I'm not giving that up. So she is passionate. She wants these kids to achieve. The teacher sees this, hears this. It's just another set of standards and expectations that she's expected to meet. So she does. She adopts the model writing. She adopts the supplemented things into her curriculum because there's this oversight where they get visits from the district workers. And if they're not meeting these guidelines, she said to Sharon in an interview, if I walk into a classroom and the teachers can't tell me what the pillars of literacy are, where they're evident in their classroom and in their daily lesson plans, I don't want them to be a teacher anymore. So there's a pressure. So the teacher said, basically, we follow the same policies as the public schools, plus the Head Start policies. We have both, and we have to adhere to both. So it makes it a little difficult. The kids don't notice anything. It's the same to them, but it's stressful for us because they contradict each other. So one of the things we tried to keep getting her to really be clear about is what are those moments of contradiction? What are these moments? Because it's great to say you feel torn, you feel a tension, you feel like you're swimming upstream, but when do you feel that and why? So one of the times this was the most clear was with the meal count. So because the state says that they have to have meals and because they're part of Head Start, it's actually a whole different funding program for them to get food into their building. This is from the program guidelines. And you can see it talks about why mealtimes are actually an opportunity for expanding children's learning and language, understanding conversational turn taking. So it's a part of the day that's important. This is from the state public pre-K. This is from Head Start. Oh, it's blurry. This is an example of table talk, what any witness who comes into the room should hear teachers saying to children. Things like, let's all sit down to eat. What are we eating today? Put all your food in your plate. Try everything. Fill your tumbler with 6 ounces of milk. That's up to the line. This idea that you have to call the cup a tumbler, this idea that you're getting the state required amount of milk even if you don't drink it. There's other policies that have to be posted, including what an ideal family style meal is. Because the program guidelines say that they want family style, but they're not really good in clearing up what they mean by that. So here is a set, and you can read them, What's interesting is that she was given this at a meeting, and you can see where she's underlined things. Plenty of food. Everyone is happy and talking, which is underlined about 6 times. So this was where she went to a meeting. They told her what to do. They told her to post this so she can reference it, and it shows that she's been informed of this, that this is the expectation. Unfortunately, Head Start also requires this meal count. So basically, they're saying, do this, the meal count, instead of worrying about the children. Do this first. Little Johnny could be running around, but do this first. Because if they, the evaluators who would come in randomly and gather everybody's meal count charts, come in and that's not done, you're written up. So the meal count has to be done a certain way. So we went to the meetings and they just said to us, oh, mark or put a check that the child ate. Or, you know, if the child sits to eat. Then we were doing that. Then they came in. Now it's when is the child sitting? They have to sit at the table even if they don't eat. So we know that we offer that food, so that's a little different. Then we're doing initials like A for absent, but that wasn't supposed to be done. And then we were marking when they serve themselves, checking. Now it's not. As soon as they sit, you do it. So it's like back and forth, and it's so overwhelming. So here's this teacher who has a majority of expectations that a lot of different types of expectations that she's supposed to be meeting, but they're all trumped by checking this checklist of who's eating when. This meal count that she does is then compared to the meal count the kitchen does, that's compared to the attendance that is taken in, and people come and gather these forms and evaluate them. And she could get written up, which could threaten her job security and her potential for future employment. She felt under a magnifying glass. And one of the reasons she felt this way was because when you walked into her classroom, well, into the building, it was actually an old factory. You would never even know that it was an early childhood center, except for a little banner with the name of the Head Start agency on it. And you walked in, and the door was always locked unless there was a certain hour of the day. And a police officer would let you in, and you'd sign in, and you'd go in. All the windows faced inward. Because it was all about surveillance. What are people doing? How is it working? So even during nap time, where there's certain expectations in terms of the lights being dimmed, their room was all alight because of these lights in the hallway. So it was a tough space to navigate, lots of different expectations. In her lesson plan, which itself is a source of conflict, because as you've noticed, the previous lesson plans we've showed you, they were digital. Public pre-K wants digital lesson plans. This is an accountability policy. Your principal, your director, your EC supervisor, anybody can look and see what you're doing. They can come visit your class. She was expected to do that. But then she was also expected to do kind of an out-of-date handwritten Head Start lesson plan. Because one of the things for Head Start is that it gets evaluated by parents, visitors to the classroom, and the center director every week. So you can see on this, the red circles show where she's thrown in the standards. The district allowed her to just do one form of lesson plan, but even though she was in a Head Start classroom and she was just in a Head Start site, this lesson plan won out because those requirements were considered more important. So in blue, you can see the requirements for the different domains, the Head Start elements she's meeting, center manager's comments and signs, parents' review and signature, and how she's going to engage family and volunteers. So she is meeting so many different expectations that whereas in the other sites, the standards were present in one, not present in another. This one, there are standards coming from every which way and direction.
So what guides the program? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? Standards seem to have a place, but the standards are not as prominent in some sites because what seems to be guiding the program is often the local values of the community or a particular set of people, and they can shape the everyday practices of what teachers do. And in some cases, it's more than one set of standards, it's multiple standards because there is no consistency. So regardless of the context in which we're in, teachers are feeling a little bit torn. And in our last context, she's certainly feeling more than torn. In fact, she left that site after being there for 8 years. They're not sure that they're able to do what they believe is good practice because of some of these standards, even though the standards we have in the state really support best practice or what we know as best practice in early childhood. So as I said, this is a starting point for us. These are preliminary findings, but we can't wait to dive into the kids stuff, which is even more juicy. But it's interesting to think about how do you systematize, because early childhood is quite different to public school, public school K-12's been going now for several hundred years. Pre-K is actually something we can do different. And yet we're beginning to adopt some of these policies that public schools have, which is okay if we also think about how local actors shape and enact policies in different ways. And then it's okay to allow for some of that variation. So that's it.
Are there any questions, comments? Karen.
So this particular presentation, you're focusing on the impact of the standards.
We're looking at whether the standards are present.
But as people who were in these classrooms, so much of what goes on in a classroom, sometimes these things are the thing the teacher does
because they have to.
Because they have to, and then they're doing this whole other activity. To what extent did you see that in these rooms, how much of the day of their time was dominated, did you think, in these? I know it's different in the 3 different settings.
In the first site, Vale Park, where I went every week, she was consistent to her plans. In fact, they were so worried about not meeting state requirements, like even a schedule. Kids were only allowed, kids in the state policy, it says they have to have 60 minutes of outdoor time. They were determined to make that, so they were sticklers for it, right? So yes, they stuck to a really strong. Whereas I think in Robe
was not really impacted by standards at all. It could be because of their position as an off-site classroom, and it was pretty isolated. They were kind of.
She wrote them.
Yeah, she did what she wanted, when she wanted, how she wanted. That's why she was able to pull down the kindergarten curriculum in that way that I think the district would have been kind of appalled by. And in Norwood, as you can imagine, standards drove everything. And usually the federal requirements of Head Start won over any kind of other standard.
Except that you said she was a fantastic teacher. So my guess is you saw.
She's a fantastic teacher, activity. But it was a more teacher-directed time. But she was so regulated. One of the things we did as part of the study is we did a classroom, which the class evaluation in every site, which judges teacher-child interactions. We went into Vale Park. The teacher said, I don't know what this is. Can I look it over? Can I see? Absolutely. Then we went into Robe. They had no idea what it was. We went into Norwood, and that teacher said, great, when are you starting? Okay, 20 minutes on? Great. I would write my score. She shifted what she was doing to have these stellar scores on this assessment because she was just assessed all the time. So.
Mary.
Do you think there's any advantage to what you said at the very end where, because I can see the disadvantages where things that are happening K-12 are coming down, right? Like the standards movement. But being later adopters, I'm wondering if there's anything to be learned by what's happening K-12 so that it doesn't happen.
Right, and in fact, I've tried to write about some of that. One of the things we're trying to encourage policymakers to think about, but see, this is the challenge of early childhood. It may be, sometimes public pre-K comes under the Department of Ed, but it may actually be co-sponsored between the Department of Ed and say the Department of Human Services or other entities, is to sort of think about what are the lessons learned. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with standards, but early childhood people are so desperate to be given a badge of merit for being seen as valid in the education world that I think that they're quick to jump on without thinking about the ramifications. So I think that there's lots of, I mean, New Jersey has shown how you can do it well without having to say it's all going to be, I mean, I don't know why, but people seem to assume you either can do sort of inquiry-based work with kids or you can't. And then you have to just lecture them. But no, New Jersey's done a really great job of doing that and has done a lot of work to sort of spread the message. But in other states, it's much less so. And when you get teachers, I think what worries me is infants and toddlers. I just can't imagine having to write standards for babies. I find that really hard as someone who's had a couple. So, so I think that there are lessons to learn, but I'm just not sure that they're willing to listen yet. And because they're trying to bridge Head Start at both the federal level and the state level, Head Start, childcare, and public schools, you get sort of these clashes of tensions, like a childcare provider doesn't want to be told that unless you're going to give them money, that they can't do certain kinds of things. And so some of the childcare sites are not, what's happening in the pre-K classroom is completely different to what's happening in the rest of the program, things like that. So I think we still have a long way to go. But we haven't had a good history book actually on preschool and early childhood for a while in terms of what are the lessons to be learned, apart from sort of how the movement came about. Marjorie.
We use the word standards, but there really are so many different kinds of standards,
That's
if you will, right? So the kinds of standards for, what makes for a safe environment, what makes for a well-qualified instructor, caregiver in the environment, those are, very important and, and so looking for at least some kind of minimum standard like that to be met. But then the kinds of standards about what is appropriate for learning because that's different. So as you're looking at this, how much do these different kinds of standards sort of get lumped together by the policymakers, in terms, and is that something that you can sift out as you're doing
we
your
haven't
work?
done that yet, but I think one of the things that's really interesting is that I think what you're hitting on is that a number of policymakers, and I think sometimes leaders assume there's one set of standards when there's always multiple sets of standards, I think, operating. And some of these aren't necessarily codified. They're actually standards that people talk into action because of the communities they work in, right? And so I think that policymakers aren't always aware of that, and they sort of have to think about, so when we talk to the superintendent, well, she's like a superintendent, she was running a program as big as some of the towns that we were in Norwood, she would say to me, well, we've spoken to that Head Start agency. We've told them they must. And once they got their funding source from the state government, from the town, they just went and continued to do it. So I think that it's part of that sort of like it's part of it's about authority and autonomy and control. But I think it's also it's very hard to break down some of these institutional histories and the values that drive them, right? And there's a tension because a lot of the early childhood people say, I've been doing this stuff for 20 years. You can't tell me because you're some public school dude that you know what to do kind of thing, even though they want the funding. So that's also another issue. And then on top of this, you layer on the fact that you have people running these programs that are less educated than the teachers in the programs, which also causes another set of tensions around what teachers can and can't do. So, yes and no. I think that's it.